Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to go over the last 15 games in the MLB season. We got about 5 series left for every single team coming into today, Friday, the 13th of September. Just complete wildness going on. Both sides of the league are a little bit different in what's going on. I think the American League seems to be a little bit more interesting as a whole because there are a couple of divisions up for grabs, whereas in the National League, not so much. It's more of a wild card race, and we'll get into that on the other side of the video. But we're just going to jump into it. Just going to be a little quick video. I thought on this Friday, having it off from work, it'd be a fun video to do. With 15 games left, you get a pretty good picture of what's going on. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about what I expect to go on. Going to be a couple of teams I'm leaving off the board. More so on this side, you maybe have the Tampa Bay Rays, who are about 6 games back. In theory, probably have a shot, but realistically, probably not. So before I jump into it, just want to remind everyone we are going to be doing a giveaway at 1,500 subscribers. So if you are not a subscriber, you can help us get to that goal faster and sooner. You got to be a sub to win. We're going to be giving away a hat when that does happen, so make sure you are a part of that. Otherwise, guys, let's jump into it. I'm going to start by taking a look at the American League East. The big story, of course, right now is the Yankees finally have started to build a somewhat of a lead. We have a 2-game lead over the Baltimore Orioles, who have continued to play 500 baseball. Really, both these teams have not been super stellar over the past few months. You would expect one of them, if they were struggling at 500 like Baltimore has, I would have expected the Yankees to kind of walk away with it, but so far they have not. The Yankees have somewhat of an easier schedule down the stretch, in my opinion. They have Boston, Seattle, Oakland, Baltimore in the second last series, and then they end with Pittsburgh. I expect them to have kind of a 600, if not better, record over these last 5 series. The big key here is they're going to have a chance to really put Boston out of the race, who is 4.5 games back of the wild card. Boston doesn't really have a shot of making it into the division race whatsoever. So they do have a shot. They won the first game. It's a 4-game set. They have 3 more this weekend. And then they have Seattle and Oakland, which I think is going to help bolster this division lead. I do expect the gap to get a little bit bigger because I believe Baltimore has kind of a tougher schedule. They have, at the very least of things, they don't really have any chance of losing out on a playoff spot. They have a few of these teams that are behind, but for the most part, we know this league has been very parity-driven this year, and most of these teams are playing 500 baseball more times than not, and they are going to be playing a lot of each other. So this 4.5-game lead is going to come into a play. It might shrink a little bit, but the fact that they're going to have to drop 3 teams, while they've basically played 500 consistently for a few months, it's not been great for them, but it's been consistent, and that's one thing you can say about Baltimore. So as long as they finish the season playing 500, without a doubt, I think they are going to finish. I think the big story here is whether they finish third and have that home field advantage in the first round or not. That could be up for debate. They do have a 3-game lead on second place Kansas City in that wild card race. Baltimore, 2 series against Detroit, which is going to come into big play for Detroit, who has kind of surprised people over the past few months in coming close. Now 3.5 games out of the playoff spot. They have 6 games against Baltimore, which is going to play a big part in whether Detroit is going to make it into this playoff conversation and whether Baltimore starts to get a little concerned. If they go 500, which I kind of expect to happen in those 2 series, then it's going to not make too much of a difference. It's going to matter what happens the rest. And Baltimore, San Francisco, New York Yankees on the road, and as well, they finished the season out against Minnesota, which could have some playoff implications in terms of seeding in that last series. So keep an eye out on what that is. But at the end of the day, I don't really expect Baltimore to be in too much jeopardy. They're just going to have to play these games out. They're going to have to get hot, and this is the time for teams to really get hot. Then we move on to the Central. I'm going to be touching on teams here and there, but the Central, Cleveland has a pretty significant lead now, 4 games in this division. They've played Kansas City a lot recently, and I do believe they're pretty much done with the division, except they have 1 series with Minnesota coming up. Not this weekend, but the next series after that, which they have a 5.5-game lead. Unless we see significant dismay of Cleveland, I guess is the word I'm looking for. I kind of expect Cleveland to kind of coast to a division closeout here. Their schedule isn't too hard. They're going to be playing Tampa Bay this weekend, Minnesota, and then they have St. Louis and Cincinnati, some National League Central Division foes, which I expect them to win some series there, and which will pretty much, I think, by the end of that, close out the division and clinch the division. They do end the season off with a series against Houston, and when we're looking at this, the two buys, I think, in the playoffs are pretty much set up for the American League. It's going to be whoever wins these two divisions, and right now, Cleveland, I think, is expected to do that. Very well could be the number one seed. I'm not going to do a prediction there, but New York or Baltimore, whoever wins this division, right now I'm leaning New York significantly, will get the other bye. So in that last series, I don't think it's going to have too much implications, especially when it comes to the bye situation. So there is that. Kansas City and Minnesota, well, Kansas City only has a 1.5 game cushion on Minnesota. It still has about 5 games on the closest wild card opponents, which are the Detroit Tigers. And Kansas City plays Pittsburgh. They do have one series against Detroit, and as long as they avoid getting swept, I think that is going to be okay. San Francisco at Washington, and ending the season at Atlanta. So a nice National League East road trip to end the season. I don't really think Kansas City has the team that gets concerned here. Their rotation and their bullpen has been strong enough that I think they're going to be able to close out this situation. The one team I am concerned about holding on is this Minnesota Twins team, because they have been the team that has been one of the most streaky teams in the MLB this season, and very well to close the season we could see a streak in the bad books. Cincinnati on the road at Cleveland, on the road at Boston after that, and that's going to be a series that is going to be super impactful in this grand scheme of the playoff picture. Then they go on to play Miami and finish the season at Baltimore. It's very possible Baltimore won't really be playing for much, but they could be playing for home field advantage, so that series could be pretty impactful. Could come down to that for Minnesota, whether or not they get in it. Then we look at the American League West, and we have a 4.5 game lead for Houston. Put Seattle on the board because 4.5 games, it's a lot to overcome with only 15 games left. You probably have to win 12 at least to really consider it, but the reason I did include them on this board is because they do have 2 roads to get there. Unlike some of these other teams like Boston, they can at least gap one team in the Houston Astros. They're technically racing one team to take over the division, while they have to hop 3 teams to win the wild card. Still a long way to go for Seattle, but and if you start to look at their schedule, you start to really realize they probably have the farthest chance out. But I did want to include them on this board just to give a grand picture of this playoff on the American League. They play Texas, New York at home, New York Yankees, that is, and then they go on the road for Texas and Houston again. The series started rough against Texas. They're in a 4-game set currently. The rest of the 3 games this weekend, they lost last night by 1 run after having a 4-1 lead. That kind of thing is kind of what's leading to the Seattle team missing the playoffs after having such a dominant division lead. And then they do close out the season in Oakland, or against Oakland at home. And I don't think that series is going to matter. I think by that point, they're pretty much going to be too far, too gone. But I just wanted to include them here. And then we have the 2 teams. Boston's probably the least likely to make the playoffs, just because I was talking about with Seattle, they have 2 real roads. Boston only has 1 road, and it's to hop 3 teams. And their schedule, while not super difficult, does lend to be a lot of division teams. And in my opinion, when you have a lot of division teams have a chance to knock you out of your playoff hopes, they're going to take every shot they can get. At New York, at Tampa, at home against Minnesota, and then on the road against Toronto, and ending with Tampa. So out of the last 15 games, 12 of them are against division opponents. 500 is not going to be good. You're going to have to win 12 games, I think, or maybe 13. So can Boston do it? I don't think so, but I did want to talk about them. The one team I do think has potential of getting in it, probably one of the hottest teams right now in the MLB, is the Detroit Tigers. 3.5 games back, not exactly insurmountable, but not exactly close yet at all. Would have loved to see them close out that series against Colorado this week with a sweep. They fell a little bit short, but they're going to be playing playoff baseball. And if this team can sneak into the playoffs, I think it's going to be one dangerous, because they've been basically playing for their lives now for a month, and they've been playing great baseball. And some of these guys, young guys, starting to come up and do big things. Baltimore, we already talked about 6 games against them. Going to be super impactful. They can start this weekend off with a sweep. This whole video is going to be a whole different story if I had filmed it after the weekend. We'll talk about it on the power rankings, of course, on Sunday. But if they can start that off, that'd be absolutely epic. And then Detroit does go on and they play at Kansas City. So we have 2 games against playoff caliber teams. Come out of here with 5 wins and you're right there in it. Come out with 4, you probably make up some ground, but you cannot lose ground on Kansas City. You have to win that series, and that's going to be very big going into next week. And then following that up, they do have at Baltimore again, Tampa Bay, and they get to close the season with the Chicago White Sox, which, mark it down, if they're in the hunt, they're sweeping that series. They have no other choice. Out of all the teams on this board, they do have the Chicago White Sox at their mercy, which is going to be super exciting for Detroit. There you guys have it. That's the American League in a nutshell, what we're dealing with over the last 15 games. A lot of impactful games, a lot of these teams playing each other, and it's the same kind of story on the other side. So let's jump into the National League. And we are back, and guys, the National League is quite a different story than we did in the American League. As you can see, I kind of set up the board a lot differently. In the American League, I had it in divisions because in that one, the divisions were still very much in play. But now when we switch over to the National League, we have all the division leaders over here on the left side, and the real reason for that is that the Phillies, I believe, 8-game lead on the division. Dodgers, 5-game lead on the division. Milwaukee, I think, similar in that 8-game range. Not really too much in jeopardy. I guess if you really wanted to talk about it, the Dodgers maybe are at most risk, but again, we were talking about it on the other side. 5 games back, it's 15 games. It's got to be some pretty bad baseball by the Dodgers. Got to be some pretty great baseball by the Diamondbacks or the Padres. And I just don't really see that happening. So in this case, the real story, I think, is who's going to get the buys in the National League. Right now, we got the Phillies and the Dodgers. Milwaukee Brewers, quite a few games out from being able to get that bye. They need 3 games to make up on the Dodgers and 4 games to make up on the Phillies. I think it might be a little bit difficult when we start talking about their schedules. Philly, for instance, has the Mets. They do have Milwaukee on the road, so that is going to be the opportunity that Milwaukee gets to try to make it up with the Phillies. But then they have the Mets again. So for the first 9 games for the Phillies, they're playing 3 series that are very, very impactful. Mets, hottest team in baseball, arguably right now. A team in the Brewers who are trying to make up that ground. And as we've seen this season, the Phillies have struggled when we start to play up in the top of our opponents. So it could very well, this could be a 9-game stretch where the Phillies and the Brewers kind of make up the ground. It's going to come down to that series, very importantly. But for the Phillies, they do end the season off with the Cubs and the Nationals, which you would expect if it comes to it and they're fighting for that bye situation, they're going to come out swinging in those 2 series. Still kind of expect them to be able to close it out. The next 9 games are going to be very impactful. If they go 2-7, not out of the question against that. 3-6, not out of the question. It's going to open things up for these other 2 teams. And the Mets are playing for their life, so do not expect them to go over lightly. Could be 5-1 very well in that series. Then when we start to talk about the Dodgers, I talked about them having a 5-game lead. And 6 games of the last 15 are against the Colorado Rockies, so that's part of why I don't expect them to go 2-13, 3-12 or whatever it would take for this gap to be overcome. So the Dodgers, I think, pretty much are on that route. They have Atlanta, they have San Diego as well, and Miami's also in there. So of the 15 games, 9 are against 2 teams that are in the very bottom row of my power rankings. So you can kind of see where that is going. Then we go to Milwaukee. Their real goal at this point is the division's locked. That's not really a question. It's whether or not they can sneak into that last shot in a bye in the first round, which on a Milwaukee team is going to be super important. We talked about the Dodgers. Their schedule doesn't really help out Milwaukee because in the grand scheme of things, Milwaukee's schedule is a lot tougher. They have Arizona for 6 games, home and home situation. Arizona, Philly, Pittsburgh, and the Mets. So like out of all of those 15 games, 12 of them are against potential playoff teams. It's going to be really, really tough to make up ground, especially 3 games against a Dodgers team that has such an easy schedule. On the other hand, can you make up 4 games against the Phillies? Sure you can, but it's really going to come down to the series they play against each other, which I believe starts next Monday, maybe Tuesday, and that's going to be it. Milwaukee has to sweep that series, I think, to be able to close this gap. That's going to be the big impactful thing. Or Philly's really got to stumble with the Mets. That's really what it's going to come down to. But if you're looking at statistic-wise, odds-wise, this is probably how it's going to end, and what can you really do about that? Then we start to get into the wild card. I left 2 teams off the board that I think are 4.5 games out. We talked about on the other side 4.5 game teams, but on this side, I just didn't really see them coming close. These 3 wildcard teams are very solid. Atlanta, right there in it with them, and they have a pretty good schedule. We have the Cubs and the Cardinals, which I could have included on this board. I just don't see it coming any close. But, the fact that I left them off this board, if you watch my videos in the middle of the summer predicting playoffs, you watch my other prediction videos, this kind of situation when I do leave teams off often comes back to bite me. So do not be surprised if the Cubs and Cardinals do something. I'm just throwing that out there for that sake. Arizona, 5 games back from the division, 2 games up in the division. They do have a somewhat tough schedule, but they have been number 1 on my power rankings over the past month. I do expect them to kind of make some strides and hold this spot. Milwaukee, at Colorado, at Milwaukee, and then closing with division rivals San Fran and San Diego at home. The series against San Diego, I'm just going to touch on it now too, is that they could end that playing each other in that series and very well could line up if it ended right now, playing each other in the first round of the playoffs. So that's something to keep in mind, and how that last series is going to play out. They could be so close as if they are now that winning that series could mean home field advantage. So are they going to throw out their best players, or are they going to save them for the playoffs? It's going to be kind of interesting how that works out. But at the same time, it's a somewhat tough schedule for Arizona. A lot of division. I think there was 12 games in there, as well as a team that is playing for a bye. So they're going to be playing a tough baseball down the stretch. They got to win these games and secure that playoff spot so that they have a chance to repeat as National League champions. San Diego, on the other hand, same kind of story, 5.5 games. I think they have 1 extra game overall here. I think it's a 4 game. I didn't write it down. So there might be 1 extra game in there somewhere. San Francisco on the road, that's this weekend. Houston, they do have the luxury of having the Chicago White Sox in the next weekend, which probably going to be a good boost and it'll help ease the tensions if tensions start to get high, especially playing San Francisco, who always plays the division tough. They got to win that series. I'm really rooting for them to do that, because if they don't, we're going to have the Mets hopping them. Atlanta's only 1 game back. San Diego has to put their pedal to the metal because they are ending the season on a pretty tough road trip. They're going out, they're playing the Dodgers, they're ending the season against Arizona. And if they don't start to build a little bit of a boost against San Fran this weekend, and then against the White Sox next week, we're going to have some scary situations, and I know who you are. San Diego could potentially miss. And then we start to go on to the New York Mets, the team that has been the absolute hottest team, I think, across the MLB. We saw them play the Jays this week in some absolute comeback in the 9th to win that series, and they continue to demonstrate that they deserve to be here, and they're going to have to continue it because their schedule is not easy. They're starting on the road this weekend against the Phillies, touched on that already. Then they go to Washington, where they hopefully can find a good sweep. That'll be a very key sweep if they can pick it up and really impact this overall playoff picture. And then they got Philly, Atlanta, and end it on Milwaukee. So the season could end with a team that's fighting for a bye and a team that's fighting for a playoff spot that very well could be playoff caliber series. And that's what's so fun about the last 15 games, is a lot of these teams are playing each other. There's a lot of playoff style baseball coming up, and with only a 1 game lead, I do think they have to continue to play lights out. Whoever struggles the most out of these 3 teams is going to be done. Their schedules overall are relatively close. I think Atlanta honestly has the best situation. The only downside to Atlanta is they do start this weekend with a 4-game set against the Dodgers, and that could set them back if they end up losing that series. I'd love to see a split there, Atlanta, at the very minimum, to stay in this race. But then they go on the road, they play Cincinnati, they play Miami, and then they have the key series against the Mets, which is going to be the biggest series of the season between these 2 teams. I'm not sure how they've matched up so far this season. I can't quite recall, but that's going to be impactful. And then they end the season at home against the Royals, team on the other side that we talked about, who is going to be playing baseball until the end of the season very well, like the rest of these teams. The Mets, it's going to come down to how Phillies go this weekend, of course, but I think the Mets have that momentum, and Phillies have struggled against top teams. For Atlanta, it's going to come down to this weekend. I want to see them come out with a series split at the very least, and then they can build up some games and at least try to catch up against Cincinnati and Miami next week, which is going to be huge. And then from there, who knows? At this point, if I had to make a prediction, I don't want to because I know I'm always wrong, but I feel like San Diego might be the team to miss right now. The only thing going for them, I think, is that Chicago White Sox series. So it's crazy. These last 15 games across the MLB are going to be absolutely epic to watch. And I like doing these videos just to kind of break down what to look for in these last 2 weeks of the season, because this season is coming to a close real fast. And before we know it, we're going to be in the playoff baseball, which I know everyone is super excited about. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Where do you think some of the most impactful games are going to be? Did I miss something super important in the dynamics of the upcoming playoff race? Did I maybe miss out on what the prediction should be? What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. I like keeping the conversation going as always, guys, and thanks for watching. We will see you for that next video.